Boker Tov. Today's daf is Memches, and just by way of introduction, in the end of the previous Amud, Mem Zayin Amud Beis, the Gemara explained the reasoning of Yochanan Kohen Gadol, who made a takana that we no longer recite Vidui Masros, and the Gemara explains why, because we don't fulfill the mitzvah as it should be done. The Torah says to give Maser Rishon to the Levi, and instead we give it to the Kohen. And that's on the top here of our daf for today, Memches. Vanan ka yavinan lakanim. And this was based on a penalty that Ezra imposed upon the Leviim. He was very disappointed that when he took people up to Eretz Yisrael from Bavel at the time of the establishment of the Bayis Sheni, the Leviim did not join him. And therefore, he made a knas that the Maser should be given to the Kohen, which on a deraisa level is okay, but that's not l'chatchila, in order to penalize the Leviim for not coming to Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, although according to the opinion of the Gemara in Masechet Yevamos, that according to Torah law, Maser Rishon can be given to the Kohen, but nevertheless, Ezra instituted that the Maser Rishon l'chatchila should be given to the Kohanim, and therefore we cannot declare that we have fulfilled the Torah's command exactly the way we were meant to do so. So the Gemara raised the following question: V'lo de ashara masros, there are other masros. Okay, let's say Maser Rishon they didn't give to the Levi as they should have, but what about Maser Sheni they brought to Yerushalayim? Maser Oni they divvied up amongst the poor people. So at least let's be Mekayim part of the mitzvah of Vidui. On Reish Lakish, no, it's a package deal, and Maser Rishon is the most important of them all. Kol Bayis, Shein Misvadim al Maser Rishon, Shuvein Misvad al Sham Masros. The Torah, as we'll soon see in the name of Abaye, puts Maser Rishon on a separate level, and therefore Reish Lakish says that if you're not going to be able to recite Vidui on Maser Rishon, then don't bother with Vidui at all. And Amar Abaye, what's the pasuk for this? Hoel pasach bo hakosuv tchila. That if you look in the pasuk, in the parsha of Maser, in Dvarim Perek Chavav, you will see that the first on the list is giving Maser to the Levi, and therefore that becomes the primary mitzvah. And if you haven't fulfilled that mitzvah the way it should be, and that was a result of the knas of Ezra, as we mentioned earlier, therefore you cannot recite Vidui at all. So the Gemara asks the following question. According to the Takani of Yochanan Kohen Gadol, it would seem that it's not that they weren't mafresh maser, they were mafresh maser. But as we said, instead of giving it to the Levi, they gave it to the Kohen. V'atanya afu bitel asavidu v'gazar al atmai l'fisha shalach b'chol gvul Yisrael, etc. So what we're going to see in just a minute is a brisa that indicates that the people of Israel were not giving maser as they should. Why? How does this brisa indicate that? And we'll get back to Gazar al Tmai in just a minute. L'fisha shalach b'chol gvul Yisrael. He sent messengers. V'rosh ein mafrishin el truma gedola bilvad. He saw that they weren't even being mafresh, not Maser Rishon, not Maser Sheni. Some was, some weren't, but the masses of people were only being mafresh truma gedola. They thought that truma gedola, since it's an Iser of Chiyuv Misa B'dei Shamayim, therefore they were careful about it. But they thought, mistakenly, that with regard to Maser Rishon, Maser Sheni, Miktsasa Maser, Miktsasa Ein Maser, those who weren't Mafresh, Maser Rishon, Maser Sheni, because they thought that, okay, the Torah commands us to do so, but it's not such a severe violation. It doesn't generate a Chiyuv Kares or a Chiyuv Misa B'dei Shamayim Om Lehem. And here's where Yochanan, the Kohen Gadol, taught them that B'nei Bonai, Bo v'omer lachem, let me teach you, my sons. Kishem shetruma gedol yesh b'hem avon misa. You're making a big mistake. Just like it tevel for truma gedol, if you weren't mafresh, generates a chiyuv misa, is kach trumas maser v'tevel yesh b'hem avon misa. So too, if let's say you were mafresh maser and you didn't take truma from the maser, that also will generate an isa tevel and a chiyuv misa v'dei shamayim. And not only that, but even with regard to maser, it would seem that if you weren't mafresh maser, and I'm talking now about maser rishon, it becomes tevel a maser. And here we have a machlokes between Rashi and the Rambam. Rashi is of the opinion that produce from which maser rishon was not taken, and therefore it has the status of tevel, would generate a chiyuv misa b'dei shamayim. The Rambam in Hilchos Maser Perek Tes says that no, it's not so. That if you eat produce from which maser was not separate, it's not punishable by death. And it would seem the pashtus in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, on Daf Pei Gimel, we derive the din of tevel from the Torah itself. And we're talking about tevel of maser. And that would apply to maser rishon, maser sheni. If you haven't been mafresh the maseros, it's tevel, and it would generate a chiyuv misa b'dei shamayim. But the Rama maintains that only in the case of truma gdola or trumas maser, if it wasn't taken off, then you chayav misa b'dei shamayim. Amad v'hiskin lahem. So now we're going to see that Yochanan Kohen Gadol made two different takanos. Number one, halokeach peres mama arts. He realized that a large percentage of the population were not being mafresh masros, and therefore, if you buy peros from an amoritz, then you cannot assume that he was mafresh maser, and therefore mafresh ben maser rishon or maser sheni. You'll have to be mafresh maser, and this is what we call d'mai. So this is the takana of d'mai. Maser rishon mafresh mimena trumas maser. After he's mafresh maser rishon, then he takes trumas maser from the maser and also the kohen. Maser sheni olav elchel b'Yushalayim. He has to take the maser sheni in Yerushalayim, but maser rishon and maser ani, this is already not an iser in the tvuah, but rather it's a chiyuv mamon that you owe the Levi maser, you owe the ani maser, and therefore, since we don't know whether or not the Amoritz was mafresh maser rishon or maser ani, therefore, when the Levi or the ani comes to collect, is hamotzi mechayev v'laraya. The owner has a right to say to him, "You prove that I have an obligation to give you maser rishon, maser sheni." And since he can't prove it, therefore you're allowed to keep it for yourself. So you're only mafresh the maser, but you don't give it to neither the Levi in the case of maser rishon nor to the ani in the case of maser sheni. So the Gemara says that now we should come to the conclusion that there are two separate takonas, tarte tike. Number one, bitel vidui de chaverim. So now we're talking about chaverim who are not ameoritz. These are scholars, these are observant Jews that certainly were mafresh their masros, and they, unfortunately, because of the knas that was imposed by Ezra, they didn't fulfill the mitzvah of giving the maser rishon as it was meant by the Torah to the Levi, but rather they gave it to the Kohen. And therefore, Yochanan Kohen Gadol established that we should no longer recite the vidur because we cannot claim that we fulfill the mitzvah the way it should be. But Gazer, a second gzeira, was al admai shalami oretz, that when you purchase produce from a person and you don't know that he's reliable, then you have to be mafresh maser, because although rov were mafresh, but there was a sizable minority that were not mafresh. The Mishnah states, "V'afu bitel es ha'ma'orin." My ma'orin. What are these ma'orin? Amar Rachva b'chol yom v'yom shahayu omdim levim al aduchna. during a period of time when it was very difficult for the Jewish people, the Levium added a kind of not a kind of a pasuk, but a pasuk in Tehillim into the Shiras HaLevium in the Beis HaMikdash. However, the period of time that we're describing now, in which Yochanan Kohen Gadol was mevatel the Ma'orer, and he didn't allow the Levim to recite that chapter in Tehillim, that was because it was a time of peace and prosperity. So, B'chol yom v'yom shayu omdim Levim al haduchan omrim ura lama tishon Hashem. Wow. Awaken, why do you sleep, God? As if to say, chas v'shalom, but it's a pasuk in Tehillim in Kapitel Memdal, that God is asleep, meaning we're suffering so much. Yochanan said to him, obviously, God doesn't sleep, and you're implying that he sleeps. And we have another pasuk in the Sefer Tehillim in chapter Kuf Chaf Al, a very famous pasuk. God doesn't slumber. He's always protecting. He's the guardian of the Jewish people. So therefore, in the Shiras HaLeviim, it's not proper to add this pasuk of God, awaken from your slumber. When the Jews are in a state of tsar, and the idol worshippers are in a state of peace, prosperity, is lekach nemar uru lama tishan Hashem. But in our time, says Yochanan Kohen Gadol, we don't have a right, we don't have license to recite such a pasuk. It's inappropriate because we live at a time of peace and prosperity, and therefore this pasuk should be omitted from the Shiras HaLeviim. Mishnah says, "V'esad nokfim," he abolished the nokfim. My nokfim. Om Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel shayu misartim li egel bein karna. So now we're talking about bringing a korban to the Beis HaMikdash, and specifically the first of the four avodos is shchita. And the challenge of shchita is that the animal moves and jumps around. The animal doesn't just lie there passively to be shechted. And they looked for a way to, in a sense, guarantee that the animal wouldn't move around and passel the shchita. So what did they do? Their practice was to cut the calf between its horns. And blood would now come down and fall into its eyes. So then the calf would not be aware of what's going on around him. You could throw the calf down on the ground and perform shchita without any problem. But also, but Yochanan Kohen Gadol came and abolished this practice because although it's not actually a mum to invalidate and passel the animal for the mizbeach, but nevertheless the spectator might think mistakenly that this is a blemish in the animal, and they bring it on the korban, on the mizbeach. Masni Sotah, we saw a slightly different formulation in a brisa. Shahayu chovtim oso b'maklos. They started beating up the animal with sticks. And that's how the idol worshippers would do. The reason why they did this was to get the animal to fall on the ground, and then when the animal was grounded, they could do the shchita. We're not allowed to bring a nevela onto the mizbeach, and your shchita is an improper shchita. Why? Because the animal, as a result of the fact that you strike it with sticks, it's going to become an nevela. Well, technically, it's not an nevela. Frek the Gemara, nevelas are shachted. They shechted these animals. That's not a nevela, but elatrefos. In other words, there's a possibility that as a result of the striking of the animal with a stick, what might have happened is shemanikev krum shalmach. Perhaps the membrane of the brain was pierced by their blows, and the animal became a treifa. It's going to die, and therefore it's also gabi mizbeach. And this is based on the principle of you're only allowed to bring on the mizbeach that which you're allowed to eat. And Yochanan created a takana which would solve the problem of getting the animal to be held in one place so that the shechita could be done properly. And what he did was he created rings that were attached to the ground in the azara, and the animals' necks were placed into these rings so that the shechita could be performed properly. I'm not exactly sure why it took Yochanan Kohen Gadol to be established this idea of tabos bekarka, like, you discovered America, so to speak. The Mishnah states, "Had Yom of Hatish Makab Yerushalayim." On the days of Chol Hamoed, the carpenters would have to do what's called a meleches davar ha'avud. In other words, we permit on Chol Hamoed, it's based on the Gemara Moed Katan Yud Aleph, that blacksmiths can perform their work on Chol Hamoed to prevent what's called an irretrievable loss. But the noise of their hammering would be heard at a very far distance, and people were not aware that this was a davar avud. They thought that, malacha is permissible on Chol Hamoed. So we see that even back in the day, people were very laid back about Chol Hamoed. So therefore, he made a takana not allowing this to go on in order to protect the Moadim Chol Hamoed. The Mishnah says, "Kol Yom lo haya adam tzarich lishal al d'mai." Hidamar, nobody had asked questions about the status of d'mai because, as we said, quoted in the brisa that we mentioned before, Yochanan made this takana to be mafresh maser from tvua that was purchased from an amoritz. The Mishnah says, "Mishabot la Sanhedrin," from the time that Sanhedrin was bought. Right, so we're talking about 71 elders. And the question here is this at the time of the Churban Abayis? And the Gemara says in Ksubis that already 40 years before the Churban Abayis, Sanhedrin left into Golus, so to speak. They left the Lishkas HaGozis. And the law of Sanhedrin is Molamich HaMokom Gorin. So Mishabot Sanhedrin would be the 40 years before the Churban Abayis. And at that point, something happened up above. As a result of the abolition of the Sanhedrin, then people started introducing into their songs improper lyrics. In other words, as long as Sanhedrin functioned, there was a supervision over the people. The people were on a level, therefore, that their songs were appropriate. But after the Bittul HaSanhedrin, the songs, things that shouldn't be sung about started creeping into the songs. Okay, fine. So what happened? Batel shir mi beis ha-mishtos. A takana was made abolishing shir from Beis Hamishtos. Now, this is a bit of a problem because as we go through the sugya, you get the distinct impression that shir, that singing, was abolished entirely. But here in the Mishnah, it's only shir in the wine festivals. They had special festivals where they drank wine, and with the consumption of wine, they would sing. The Meiri says that we're talking even about a wedding hall. But in any event, a gathering where wine is imbibed, even in a private house, song is forbidden. And the Gemara in Gittin Daf Zayin establishes that this Isur is not just limited to musical instruments, meaning to instrumentals, but it includes even capella as well, a cappella as well. And we're going to see this in our Gemara. Shenemar, and the Mishnah quotes a pasuk in Yeshayahu Perikaf Dalid, Bashir lo yishtu yain. They shall not combine song with the drinking of wine. Mishamesu Nevim Rishonim, we don't know who these Nevim Rishonim are. The Gemara is going to discuss that. Bitlu Urim V'Tumim. They can no longer ask the Urim V'Tumim and receive an answer. Now, exactly what the Urim Tumim was is actually a machlokas Rishonim, although the majority of the Rishonim assumed that it was a klaf upon which they wrote the Shema Meforosh, and they placed it into the fold that was doubled over in the choshe, the breastplate, that was worn by the Kohen Gadol. However, there are Rishonim, including the Rambam, who understood that the Urim V'Tumim was the choshen itself. So that's a long discussion about Urim V'Tumim, and you can take a look in the Encyclopedia Talmudit. Now, after the Nevi'im ceased to prophesy, there was no longer Urim V'Tumim, because Urim V'Tumim is also a kind of a nevuah. So we're going to have a whole sugya here today about the shamir, which is some sort of a creature that maybe a worm or something that would penetrate any substance and it would cut the stones. And we're going to speak about nofes tzufim, what that is all about. Anyway, they can no longer find the shamir, the nofes tzufim, after the Churban Abayis. Upasku anshe amana b'Yisrael. And people of faith who would rely totally on Hashem, and they had a trust in Hashem, that Hashem would provide their needs. They're willing to spend lots of money on charity, lots of money on Hidur Mitzvah, or on Sudas Shabbos, Sudas Yontif. They were never nervous that their means would be depleted. They had total faith. And Pasku Anshe Amana, with the Churban Abayis, there ceased to be these people of faith. Shenemar, and this we see in Tehillim, when David HaMelech prophetically says, as he prophesies about the destruction of the Mikdash, Hoshia Hashem ki gomar v'chasid. Save us, Hashem, for the pious and no more. Those of faith have vanished from there. Rav Shimon Gamliel Omer,Heid Rabbi Yoshua, Miyom shechar beis hamikdash ein yom she'ein bo klol. From the day of the Churban, there's no day that passes by without a curse. And the Gemara later on Daf Mem Tes, before we finish the Masechet, is going to establish that each day's curse is worse than the day before it. And Rav Shimon Gamliel says, V'nital tam haperos. I'm sorry, V'lo yorad hatal lebracha. The dew did not descend to bless. He knew that the dew had been cursed. When the dew fell in earlier times upon straw and stubble, they would whiten, but now they became black. V'nital tam haperos, the flavor was removed from the fruit. Rabbi Yossi Omer af. So I had a peach yesterday with the Shechon, and I really enjoyed it so much. And I was thinking to myself, what did it taste like at the time of the Mikdash? Could you imagine? Rabbi Yossi Omer Afnital Shuman Haperos, some sort of the cream, perhaps, the richness of the fruit was removed. Rabbi Shimon Elazar Omer Hatahara Notla Es Hatam Eshareh. Now, when it says tahara, it really means the cessation of tahara, right? Without the Beis Hamikdash, there's no possibility of being mitayar. And as a result of this termination of tahara, the flavor and the fragrance of food was removed. Now, what does this mean? Fragrance and flavor. Now, back at the time of the Mikdash, there were ochlei chulin b'tara. So the Jews ate their food b'tara. And as long as the people conducted themselves in this state of tara, and they avoided Tumah, Hashem purified their fruit, removing any unpleasant flavors or aromas. Once the practice of tara ceased, foreign flavors and aromas began to contaminate the fruit. Hamasros natlu es shuman adak. When they ceased being mafresh maser, that removed the richness of the dagon, of the species, all species of grains. So that Maser is called by the Torah in, I believe it's in Parsha Shlach, the chelev of the Tvua. It's the cream of the produce. When the people sinned and they failed to bring Maser, to be mafresh Maser and give it to the Ani or to the Levi, their punishment was the decrease in the richness of the vein, of the grains. Now the Maharsha adds a little point here that just like Tara is intangible, it's a spiritual entity, its cessation, meaning when they were no longer betara, leads to a loss of intangibles. So that Tara is intangible, and the cessation of Tara leads to the loss of something intangible, which is flavor and fragrance. In the case of Maser, however, that's a corporeal chefetz, that's an object, a physical object. And failure to be mafresh Maser is punished by the loss of cream, which is a corporeal component of the grain. Chachamim omrim haznus v'akshofim kilu es hakol. Because of znus and sorcery, that brought an end to all. And what does that mean? It means that promiscuity, according to Chazal, is the source or the cause of famine. And in fact, we already have Gemaras in other Masechtas that if a person has a relationship with a Zonah, then he'll be reduced in his financial status to a state of destitute. He'll be searching for a loaf of bread. And Kishuf undermines the authority of the Bezdin Shel Mala to benefit mankind. The Gemara says, how do we know that that pasuk that describes that they didn't drink wine with song is a reference to the time that the Sanhedrin was abolished? Amar Rav Huna Breder Rav Yeshua, the Amar Kra. We have a pasuk in where's this pasuk in Eicha? The Amar Kra is Kedim Ishar Shavasu Bachurim Miniginasam. The elders are gone from the gate, the young from their music. So we're talking about the elders from the gate, which is a reference to the Sanhedrin, because the pasuk tells us that Sharecha, in your gates you appoint judges and officers. So this pasuk is teaching us that when the elders, meaning the Sanhedrin, were gone from the gate, then the young are legally banned from their music. So there's a prohibition against music that coincided with the termination of Sanhedrin. That's already 40 years before the Churban Abayis. And the Mishnah seems to use that pasuk to refer specifically to music at parties, at wine festivals, and that's when the Easter exists. But we get an opposite impression from the Gemara, because Amar Rav, Uda de Shama Zimra Te'akeh. The ear that listens to music should be torn loose. In other words, our hearing will be ill affected when we listen to the wrong kinds of music. Now, we're going to see soon that there's certain music that you're allowed to listen to. But basically, we were given ears for the purpose of listening to Chachma, to Torah, words of insight, and he wastes his precious time listening to music or other vanities. He abuses the special gift of hearing. I always wondered why we don't make a brach every day on hearing. And this is fitting that his ears be torn from his head. Omar Rava, Zimra bebeisa churva besefa. Now we're going to emphasize the word besifa. Sifa is a lashon of saf. Saf means the threshold. So music in the house brings destruction to the threshold of the house. Shenemar. And where do we see this? In Tzfanya Hanovi. That's pretty rare, a pasuk in Tzfanya. Kol yishorer b'chalon choref b'saf ki arza era. A voice will sing out in the window desolation will be at the threshold, for the cedar work is a city. Now that's a strange phrase. Cedar work, which sounds like a building or a small house in a city, is being compared to desolation in the threshold. Mai ki arza era. What is the meaning of this pasuk? The cedar work is a city. Rabbi Yitzchak. So Rabbi Yitzchak says the following, or Rashi has Rabbi Yosef, that Bayis Hamesubach be'arazim irhu. How do we understand this pasuk? We're talking about a house that sits in the thicket of cedars, cedar trees, which is strong, difficult to destroy, and it's like a city. Ella, but rather, no. Afilu bayis hamesubach be'arazim misroah. When music is being played, even a house that sits in a thicket of cedars that's very well protected will be destroyed. And that's what the Navi is telling us according to Rabbi Yitzchak. So the word Era really has two meanings. It's related to the word Ir, a city, and Era also means destroyed. Amar of Ashi, Shma minoki maschil churva. The destruction begins in a house at the threshold, the Sefer Maschil. Shenemar, Chorev, Besaf. Desolation will be at the threshold. We could derive the same conclusion from a pasuk in Yeshayahu Navi, Ushe'ia Yukas Shar. And from the desertion, the gate is stricken. In other words, there's another alternative source for Ashi that the destruction of a house begins with the threshold, but there's an additional source for Rava's statement that music in a house causes its destruction. So Yeshayahu Navi states this pasuk shortly after he had already given that pasuk in the Mishnah, they shall not drink wine with song. So the word she'iyah derives from the word sha'ah. The root of the word is sha'ah, desertion. And it's teaching us that since the house is deserted, then it's going to be rampaged by demons, by all sorts of powerful demons that are goring and crushing the gates. And not only that, Omar Mabra Avashile Didi Chazile, I actually saw this. There was a demon at work in a vacant house, Menagech Ki Torah, and he was goring it like a rampaging bull. Omar Avhuna Zimra de Nagdi Udevakre Shari. There are cases or scenarios in which we're allowed to listen to music. What are they? Number one, Nagde. These are boat haulers. They pull boats by rope along the canals and the docks. It's a strenuous job, and singing is to strengthen and quicken them to do the work. And then we have the bakre. Bakre are plowers. The plowman's singing relaxes the oxen that are pulling the plow because they find it pleasant. Again, we're talking about a cappella, it seems. Hence, they will proceed steadily ahead, right? We're talking about the oxen, creating straight furrows. So since in neither of the cases is the music for the purpose of the singer's enjoyment, it is permitted. This is where the poskim talk about taking music lessons, like during the 3 weeks, 9 days, and so forth and so on. The gardai asir, but the music of the weavers is prohibited. Apparently, this music was for the purpose of frivolity. Their work was not strenuous, music was not necessary to energize them. Again, it would seem from this Gemara that the Isser of music would apply even when it's not at a feast and not at a wine feast, which is against the Gemara. Well, that's a bit of a pella over here that has to be studied. There's a Tosas in Gittin that wants to make a chilik a distinction between a person who engages in music regularly, and for him, it's forbidden even without wine. So it really has to do with an excess of levity. Rav Huna batil zimmer, Rav Huna banned music, kam mea avazi bezuze. In the heavenly courts, the heavens were so thrilled about this that the financial situation changed as a result. It's so interesting how, spirituality can affect physicality. And you could purchase with one zuz 100 geese, or mea sa chita bezuza. You could purchase 100 sa of wheat, a massive amount of wheat, at one single zuz. Below he bought. And if you charged them a zuz, people didn't want to purchase it. They thought even a zuz was overpriced. So this is all indicative of bounty, which divine providence responded so bountifully to their abstaining from music that even the price of a zuz was considered too high. Also, Rav Chizda zilzelbe, but Rav Chizda somehow did not support this ban of Rav Huna, and as a result, by disparaging the ban or not reprimanding those who flouted the ban, then as a result, the extraordinary divine blessing was withdrawn, and you wanted to buy even one single goose for a zuz, you couldn't find it. Before you could get 100 goose for one zuz, and that was overpriced. Rav Yosef Zamri Gavri V'Anshi Noshi. Now we're talking about choirs, or a choral group of singing. The men sing and lead, the women respond. They answer responsibly. Pritzusa, that's obscenity. Zamri Noshi is even worse. Let's say the women sing, they lead in the singing. V'Ani Gavri, and the men respond. Then ke'esh b'nei oris. That's like a fire in a toe of flax. L'maynaf gemina, who cares? It's also in both cases. And the Gemara answers, Levitule ha. If we could only ban one of these two choirs, which one takes precedent? And that is the women singers, because that's a worse aver. That's called ke'esh b'nei oris. On Rabbi Yochanan, kol hashosar ba minei zemer. Anyone who, while he's drinking wine, while listening to 4 types of music, Mevi Chamesh Puranios Olam. He'll bring 5 types of calamities into the world. Shenemar, as the pasuk tells us in Yeshayahu Novi, Perek Hey, Hoy mashkime baboker sheichar yirdofu me'acharei b'nefesh yain adlike. Woe to those who arise early in the morning to pursue beer, who stay up late at night while wine inflames them. V'haya kinor v'novel tov v'chalil v'yayin mishteim v'eis Paul Hashem lo yabitu. So here are the 4 types of music. There's the harp, the lyre, the drum, and the flute. And then it says the yayin mishteim, and wine at their parties, at their mishtan. But they do not contemplate the deed of Hashem, will not look at the work of his hands, which is a reference to Torah. Maiksiv Achrov, what it comes after this? Where are the 5 calamities? And the pasuk continues and says, Lachein gola ami mibli das. Therefore, my people will be exiled because of their ignorance. Shegormim golosli olam. These indulgent people who are busy partying and playing music and so forth cause exile to be brought in the world. And that's midah teneged midah, because exile will counteract music. Music inflames one's passions, and exile shatters his passions, distracts his mind from pleasure. Ukvodo mesei rav, and it's honored ones dying of starvation. Shemivim ra'av liol, they bring starvation to the world. V'hamono tziche soma, and its multitudes parched from thirst. Shegoru l'torah tishtakach milomdea, they caused the Torah to be forgotten from its students. So this is a spiritual thirst. Vayishach adam vayashpil ish, and people will be humbled, and man will be brought lower. Shegarmin shiflus l'sono shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, really, what it means is that it says vayishpal ish. The ish is a reference to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as we'll soon prove. And instead, the Gemara formulates it like as a euphemism that they cause degradation for those who hate the Holy One. But in truth, we're talking about degradation for Hashem, which is occasioned by the degrading of the scholars, which causes them to forget the Torah. So Hashem's degradation is the concealment of Hashgacha Pratis in this world, Anhaga, the divine providence. The word Ish is used to describe Hashem, and it connotes his divine presence in this world. As the Gemara proceeds and says, "Ve'eni ish ala Kadosh Baruch Hu shenem Hashem ish milchama, the ene gvoim tishpalna, and the eyes of the haughty will be brought low." And all this is Yeshayahu Perkei. Shegarmim shiflus shel Yisrael. They teach. This pasuk teaches us that they cause the degradation of the nation of Israel. Umayksiv acharav, and afterwards, those who indulge in this drinking wine and in the music, the 4 types of music, and what's going to happen as a result. Now, the Navi is going to reveal the punishment that befalls individuals that brought calamities upon the world. So until now, we're talking about the calamities, and now we're talking about the punishment for the individuals.